Hi, hello. This is academic presentation, and I will start by saying that I am an Egyptian American who lived about 30 years of my life in Egypt, and during that time, being the minority Christian, I was always exposed to questions from Muslim people challenging my faith, and all of their questions are stemming from a wrong understanding of the foundations of Christianity. Most of their questions were around the resurrection, the cross, and there was a need for an answer, especially that the resurrection of Christ is one of the most important part of our faith. And we need to be prepared to give an answer, not only to people who are from different religions or people who are attacking Christianity, but also for our brothers and sisters who they need to have some kind of a confirmation or a strengthening of their faith. I picked my topic about the post-resurrection appearances. And there are three lines of argument about that topic. One is the empty tomb, and then the post-mortem appearances of Jesus and the origin of the disciples' faith. These three lines of argument are needed and strong for the task of argument to the resurrection of Christ. I picked one of them, as I said earlier, is the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and they are the most difficult to discuss and most important as well. To pick an answer, it has to be the right answer. I remember when I was a resident in the medical school, the professor put an X-ray and he asked us to give the right diagnosis. And of course, we all rushed into mentioning pneumonia, emphysema, that is lung cancer, fluid in the lung, all of these kinds of things, trying to find the right diagnosis. And at the end, when we all failed, he said, this is an X-ray of a normal chest X-ray. It is a normal one. And he said to be able to diagnose the abnormal, you have to be really familiar with what is normal. And when it comes to the post-resurrection appearances, we have to know the right answer to be able to identify the wrong ones. And the right answer is always the biblical one. And once we know the biblical one, we will be able to identify the wrong one. To embark in that task, the post-resurrection appearances, I read 41 articles, good portions of 2 books, about 1,200 pages in total, and summarized them with many opinion, and I put them in categories. Hopefully that will help to have a big picture of the post-resurrection appearances. There are 2 big divides here. The post-resurrection appearances have 2 campuses. The naturalistic campus, where these people believe that anything should be explained through science and through logic way. Miracles and godly intervention in time and history, these things are not acceptable, and they will always try to find an alternative way to explain these things, because they look at the biblical texts that pertain to supernatural things as myth, and it's not true. The second camp will be the supernaturalistic camp, where we believe that miracles exist. We believe that God is a good God, and he is, for his good purposes, will interfere in history to accomplish these godly purposes. I adopted, with some freedom to change a little bit in it, Gary Habermas, a categorization of the post-resurrection appearances. And under each one or each theory, I put more details about it. So there is a naturalistic subjective and objective theory, and then the supernatural subjective and objective theory. It's rare enough to see a flying carp, but to get a picture of a bird hitching a ride on a flying carp, I mean, one in a gazillion. And this, of course, is a sarcastic way to look upside down or opposite what's happening. So I'm in a way saying that here is the liberal logic, so buckle up. The first theory, the naturalistic subjective theory. The appearances are something that happened to the disciples, but it is related to their internal faculties. They did not see anything in reality, or as someone said, they cannot capture it in a video camera or by video camera. Nothing happened in real time and space. So under that big title or big theory, there are smaller ideas. One is the hallucination theory or subjective visions. Now I want to highlight the difference between hallucination, visual hallucination, and visual illusion. Hallucination is that you see something when there is no reason or inciting stimuli to make you see that. The illusion is the opposite, where you see something but you misinterpret it or you see it in a different way. So, for example, visual illusion, you see a tree branch but you see it as a snake, when in fact the tree branch gave you this vision of the stimuli of the snake. Visual hallucination, there is no tree, there are no branches, but you still see a snake which is coming out of no stimulus at all. Dominic Crossan believed that the disciples had this attitude. They couldn't accept that Jesus is dead, and out of their grief they started to see visions of him. Gerd Ludman also stated that shared hallucinatory fantasies started during the appearance to 500 with one or two others, and that the brothers of Jesus went to Jerusalem and were caught in this mass ecstasy. I want to talk a little bit about Peter and later on about Paul. They have many theories related to them specifically. Goulder said that Peter had a hallucination of Jesus, and these hallucinations are coming from his low self-image and his grief and guilt for denying him. So he started to have these visions, and then he went to share these visions with the disciples, who on their own started to have their own hallucination about the risen Jesus. And he called this a communal delusions, or infectious hallucinations, and or mass hysteria. Many terms trying to explain something that is hard to have a fact about it. And that's a typical pattern that we're gonna see. And he said that these are similar to Bigfoot or UFO sightings. Now the response to this would be that personally, in my professional career as a physician for 25 years now, hallucinations are just a lifelong condition or conditions, and the patient has it for years, and they know about it. Some of them even can differentiate that it's a hallucination, and none of them is in response to just emotional circumstances alone, but it is a disease. Not to mention that statistically speaking, you have a hallucination in 500 people, or 13 or 12 or 11 at the same time. I'm going to touch base on it, but it is not scientific in any way. Dr. Licona on this group hallucination, he mentioned something very interesting also, and he said that group hallucinations is not documented in the books of psychology or psychiatry, and it's rare to impossible that a group of people will have hallucinations at the same time. He also mentioned that Bigfoot and UFO sightings will fall maybe under illusion more than hallucinations, because sometimes people will say we saw something, but maybe it's not Bigfoot, but they thought it is. So there is an illusion, not hallucination. So we cannot compare the two really. He mentioned that these are just speculations with no evidence. And here is my point again. I want to emphasize it, that hallucinations cannot occur at the same time to 500 followers and about the same person and having the same content. So they may have a diverse hallucinations happening different times about different things, but to all of them have it at the same time about the same person and to say the same stuff, that's not following psychiatry or psychology. Another point is that if you're gonna have or you're gonna make hallucination about Jesus, you might as well just make it in a glorious manner, that he appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, white, shining. Moses came from the mountain after taking the Ten Commandments. His face was shining. All of these things, it's engraved in the Jewish tradition that if you want to have something like this, it better be a glorious manner. Even some angels appearing, they will appear with a very white robes and things like that, which is not the case. Jesus' appearances after the resurrection were not glorious in nature. Now, Paul is also having a different story. Gulder, Crossan, Ludman, they shared similar opinions about Paul. That here is the story. He was dissatisfied with the Jewish faith. He was attracted to the Christian God. And he also, Ludman said, he had a childhood friend who was a Gentile friend. And then when he grew up with this dissatisfaction, attraction, he had a struggle how to resolve this mental tension. He had a hallucination that he saw Jesus who sent him to the Gentile, hence the story of my youth friend who was Gentile. And they say that it was a vision experience without bodily appearance. Dr. Lecuna responded by saying that Paul was not grieving the death of Jesus, and he doesn't have any reason psychologically to have a hallucination about him. And even a visual hallucination will not lead Paul to deduct or conclude that he was raised bodily. About the dissatisfaction, we don't have in his letters anything to support his dissatisfaction with the Jewish God. So here is a point. Modern psychologists often find it difficult to diagnose patients correctly while they are sitting in front of them, even after they question them extensively. And this statement, in my opinion, is true, because you rarely find someone who is psychologically having issues that he has a one problem. It's usually several problems mixed together. So you may have an element of depression with obsession and some anxiety, and he may have 50% of the picture on the depression, 20% here. So it's not just a one thing coming at you, it's just a multiple problems. And maybe some of them also will need counseling, and childhood problems also messing the picture. So it's very hard, and it takes a lot of gifts and listening to people who are sitting in front of you for hours. Non-professionals like Gulder, Ludman, Crossan, Craffords are far more likely to misdiagnose those whom they have never met and who lived 2,000 years ago and in a foreign culture, which makes sense. Number two, under the first theory, is visions in the subliminal consciousness. Christ appeared in and through the disciple imaginative faculties. It was a religious vision, and it's an imagination rather than a bodily appearance, and it is a product of their human psychology or psyche. And we're going to see similar reason or similar causes like these under different titles. So it's not like a new discovery. It's just they change the wording to look like it's a new discovery when it's the same stuff. In fact, I had difficulty. Should I put them all under one topic and finish? Or should I divide them? But I prefer to divide them, so if we come across a different term, we know that it was addressed in this presentation. The response is that in this idea, they have to be disciples first to apply this religious vision about Christ to them. We cannot apply it to Paul, who was not a follower and didn't need a religious vision to justify Jesus. If Paul had any religious vision, I would recommend a different style. He would have an imagination that he succeeded in capturing all of these Christian rebels and punishing them all. That would be the natural, normal, expected vision, religious vision of Saul, who was a Jewish zealot, and he wanted to serve his faith properly. The brothers of Christ were not followers of his teaching, and he was a disgrace to the family. If anything, they want to distance themselves, like Peter did at the day when they captured Jesus. He denied him 3 times. That's very natural, acceptable response of a human being. I don't want to be in any way related to that person. So his 2 brothers would say, we want to distance ourselves and not do the opposite. Also, I remember that Peter had a dream or a vision in Acts 11 where God told him, all of these animals, go ahead, slaughter and eat. And Peter said, I don't eat anything unholy. And it was like an indication that God is permitting the Gentiles to enter. And then he had his meeting with Cornelius at that time. Now, in all of that, Peter did not mistake this with a real appearance, but he knew it was a vision. So the disciples are able to differentiate between it is vision and not. Mystic experience, Giza Vermes said that believed that Jesus followers had a powerful mystic experience, and this transformed them. They felt Jesus' presence, and then all of a sudden they were convinced that he was raised. And because of that, they went away. They went all over to say that he was raised. Some believers felt that this is a telepathic communication. I'm not going to even comment on that. Response to this, the mystical experience may happen to some, but not to all of them at the same time. And what is the cause of this all of a sudden mystic experience? No one knows, and he cannot explain it. Paul and James would not have this mystical experience since they were not followers of Jesus. Again, another one, a new experience of grace and forgiveness had nothing to do with the empty tomb or reports of seeing Jesus. Just they had a profound religious experience of that grace, and there was a misleading language of a bodily resurrection. And he said that this happens to people who are already believers. He had to manipulate the story of Paul to fit his theory, since he was not a follower. The story of James cannot explain that theory of grace, and he cannot explain why they came to faith in the first place that Jesus is resurrected. So in summary, the naturalistic subjective theory, it has many versions, as we saw, and hypotheses to explain what happened to the disciples. The real challenge, as I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to explain the many appearances of Jesus, the different locations, the different people he appeared to, and the different dialogues he had with them, as all of this are just a mere hallucination. Maybe one appearance could be accepted as hallucination, but all of them be explained as this way is hard to accept. If the bodily appearances hypothesis turn out to be the best explanation of what happened, it should not be excluded as the most reasonable and logic cause of the faith and charisma of the disciples. This is the pyramids, my treasure of home from home. I never have seen the pyramids. I didn't see them at all, except the tip of the big pyramids while I was in a cab driving, going to the airport to immigrate to America. Sadly enough, I did not see that. and it will be, if I ever see it, as a tourist like everybody else. The naturalistic objective theory. This theory states that something happened to the disciples, but it is related to their external faculties. But still, it was not a bodily appearances. They did actually see something, but some of these were not real, and it cannot be captured by a video camera. A ghost. They have seen something, it was a ghost. And they claim that a spiritualist, someone who prepared ghosts, produced this phenomena. He made the ghost to appear and disappear over and over again in front of the disciples, and then the disciples thought that it was a resurrected Jesus. Now, the spiritual medium person had to follow the disciples and prepare a ghostly appearance whenever he wants, without the disciples' knowledge, which is not the custom really of preparing ghosts. They have to be in a room, quiet, dark, on a table, and all of these things. So it doesn't fit really the story. Also, it is really difficult to accept that a ghost will have a Christ-like speeches as the gospel record them. If the spiritual medium, the person, assuming that he has control of the appearances, he would limit himself to one location instead of rushing from Emmaus to Jerusalem to Galilee. I mean, he will make all the appearances in one place, which will make more sense and to be more logic. They saw something, the disciples, yes, but it was a mistaken identity. They saw someone who looked like Jesus, and they believed that that person is the resurrected Christ. They saw a twin brother of Jesus who represented him, and this led to the conclusion that he was raised from the dead. Of course, the mistaken person, or the person who looked like Jesus, has to inflict himself with fresh deadly wounds to convince the disciples that he is the one. He needs to be able to disappear and appear at will in front of them, like the Emmaus disciple, or entering the room when the 10 disciples were gathered. A twin brother who suddenly appeared after 33 years of nothing is hard to accept, plus the wounds he has to inflict on himself. Now, I feel like, who is willing to represent a person who is a blasphemer and an enemy of the Jewish leader, an enemy of the state? Everybody want to distance himself from him, and all of a sudden someone will say, no, I am that person. Maybe come again, hang me again. And I mean, I don't think it's logic. And what happened to that mistaken identity person? Did he live a long life after that? Got married and died later on? Where is his tomb? Very weak theory. The soon escape theory is something that had its own success time. Jesus didn't die really. He just went to a coma, or fainted from the pain, the trauma of the crucifixion. When he was put in the tomb, the cool air or atmosphere revived him, and he was able to get out of his wrapped cloth and the tomb, and he appeared to the disciples. What the disciples really saw was not the resurrected Jesus. It was the real person who just didn't die at all, who was just fainted and came back from that fainting process. The response to this idea, I shrank it to this because it was a lot. Now we're going to assume that the Roman soldiers who are expert in execution couldn't, kill one person, and they reported his death when they need to break his leg for him to die, but they said he is dead. So we're going to doubt their expertise in killing and their expertise in identifying a dead person. The spear that they thrusted him in his side, blood and water came. Blood and water in a medical term is a sign of someone who had pulmonary edema or a severe case of congestive heart failure. His lungs were full with fluid because the heart failed to pump the blood outside this area of the lung, and it was congested. That is a sign of someone who died. We have also Joseph and Nicodemus who prepared him during his burial, and they would have discovered if he is still breathing or still alive. He had many wounds and injuries, and the natural law, talking about, they talk about science and logic. I mean, here is the logic. Someone who has dehydration, he said, I'm thirsty, and he has sepsis, and he has wounds, and these nails, we have horses, they can have tetanus and infection. And then we're going to say that after all of that, a cool air of the tomb healed him or make him feel better. And then he stayed 40 hours without food or drink, got himself out of the cloth, pushed a heavy rock blocking the tomb, walked many miles to convince his follower that he is the victorious Lord over death. That doesn't really fit. And in the past, it went out of favor, and it's coming again. I don't know why. The same theme, I'm repeating it, like what is more likely, what is more logically, what is more making sense, what is more reasonable. If the bodily appearance hypothesis is the one, then it should be believed. The Sphinx, very close to the pyramids in Giza. This is an area in close to Cairo in Egypt, and the poor guy, the Sphinx is the head of a man and the body of a lion, as we can see, but the poor guy, he doesn't have a nose. He used to have a nice, good-looking nose, and when Napoleon Bonaparte, the French leader, conquered Egypt as a sign of dominion, he broke his nose, like I broke your nose, O you Egypt, and I conquered you. So it was a sign or a gesture of victory, and so far until today, Mr. Sphinx is without a nose because of that. Number C, supernatural. Now we're going to the supernatural subjective theory. Now they believe that Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to his follower, but it did not still involve a physical body. The appearances were from heaven, not physical, but it was like his spirit appeared to them. Anything that is about tactile, like, come and touch me, I'm gonna eat in front of you, all of this, they consider these verses non-historical and mythical in nature. Here is some arguments for that idea. Peter Crawford claims that the women at the tomb saw visions of angels. They saw angels, and later on they saw Jesus. So he concluded that seeing Jesus was not any different from seeing the angels. Giza Vermes, in his book on the resurrection, he said that Jesus has an idea about the resurrection is like angels who do not marry and get married. And consequently, in his resurrection appearance, he was in an angelic form. Michael Goulder's view was that Jesus' resurrection was spiritual, immaterial, and embellishments came later on to fill the gaps about an empty tomb and bodily appearances. Gerd Ludman claims that all of the appearances were just visions, subjective visions. Later on, more sophisticated Christians reinterpreted the claim that Jesus has been symbolically raised. Sophisticated Christian, they throw terms like this. I would like to know his definition of sophisticated Christian, and a bunch of fishermen and farmers and illiterate people who are living under the occupation of Roman. Response: the disciples would know that they have seen a spirit of Jesus and not just his physical body, and that's true. Visions of the dead could not by themselves have given rise to the belief that Jesus has been raised from the dead. The idea is that if you see a spirit of someone, most probably it means that he is dead. When in the book of Acts, when Peter came out of prison and he went to tell his friends, a servant opened the window of the door, and then she saw Peter. She saw his spirit because she assumed that he is dead. And all of this, seeing the spirit of Jesus, the tomb is still the body is occupying the tomb at that time. And it will be a confirmation to them that, yes, indeed, we saw his spirit, but not resurrected body. And then they would not have to record verses about come, touch me, give me some food to eat. They will record that they paid respect to his tomb, visiting him and so on. And their kerygma will say, his spirit appeared to us and instructed us to do this, or told us to do this. And that's not the case, really. So in short, this view has many gaps to be considered really a reason why the Christian faith is born and why the disciples went on to preach their message. Again, if the bodily appearances is the best hypothesis, it should be addressed as the real one. A close-up of the Great Pyramid. These stones are, 10 tons, each one of them. Always they say, how did they made them go up to reach that height? But there is another mystery, how they stayed connected together. Another theory about that said that the gap of the air in between the two stones made a negative pressure, like suction, to stick them together. It's a very interesting theory. I added this to Gary Habermas' division or categories, a new understanding. A group of researchers felt that we don't know anything about what the Bible is teaching. For 2,000 years, we misunderstood the meaning of it, and then they are now telling us that there is a new understanding. What is the resurrection really? You missed it, and this is a new understanding of the resurrection. It has a different meaning. Okay, I put three of them here. The resurrection is just a prophecy. Jesus was the expected Messiah. He fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. So the word resurrection means really that he fulfilled the prophecies about him. Another one is the community organization. Do you know that Jesus was resurrected? You want to know how? By looking at the behavior of the disciples. They met Jesus. When the grace of God emerged through their hearts, forgiveness occurred and sin was partially overcome. So resurrection to them is by seeing how your behavior in community is showing that. But nothing really happened to Jesus' body. It was a doxology. Someone said that the letter 5, or multiplication of it, in the Greek mythology, it means perfection. So Paul used in 1 Corinthians 15 doxology, or a term of appear to 500, just to say that Jesus completed everything that was expected of him. The resurrection is just a metaphor. Crossan stated that Christ's resurrection it's a metaphor of God's justification of the world. It's a metaphor of people experiencing new beginning. It's a language that metaphoric but not historical. Dr. Licona states that there is no indication that the early Christians interpreted Jesus' resurrection as a metaphor. Literal bodily resurrection was intended. It was not meant to be, if it was not meant to be literal, the disciples would not be saying that they did not steal the body, for instance. They would say it's simply a metaphor, and we are just proclaiming the general resurrection. And any Christian opponent would have criticized them for not understanding poetry and metaphor. And any Christian leader through history would come and correct this misunderstanding. An altered state of consciousness. Crawford's he is crafting, playing on words here, some of the psychological stuff. He came with three of them. I'm going to mention here the altered state of consciousness. And it's just, like we saw him, and it's in our imagination or our vision, and this is in our culture how it is. And he's saying that, they said that they saw him. We have to believe them because this is what they believe and this is what their culture said. We have to respect their culture. We have to respect what they said. It doesn't mean that it is true. It doesn't mean that we have to follow or obey that, but we have to glean from it what is really meant by seen. So a researcher had to look. When they say we saw, what do they really mean? When they say his body, what kind of body do they mean? And he put it there as a doubting the resurrection appearances as a reality. In response, Dr. LeCun wrote that Crawford needs to prove that they were all experiencing an altered state of consciousness. And he mentioned that there is another state called ordinary state of consciousness. Both of them were used by God to convey messages to his prophets and his people. So they would see dreams and visions, which is an altered state of consciousness. And then at the same time, they will see reality in time and space. And this is the ordinary state of consciousness. Abraham, when he saw three men coming at him, and we believe that Christ's reincarnation at that time, telling him that he will burn Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham was not in an altered state. He was not seeing a vision or a dream. It was a reality to him at that time. So this is another example of that. The resurrection was just a parable. Appearances story, just a parable, the empty tomb and the appearances, just, it's a parable. Luckily enough, we have so many parables in the New Testament, in the Gospel, and they have a pattern, they have a purpose. Most of them will start with and he told them a parable, or he will say, the kingdom of heaven is like. So these are the parables, and they will involve explanation. And many times Jesus explained these to his disciples. People knew that they were stories and parables, and the disciples would not promote a resurrection story without clarifying that it is a parable, and they would save themselves from dying, confessing the appearances were just a parable. It's not true. But that's not the case, of course. Someone said that the resurrection appearances and all the resurrection issue is just a theological teaching about something that will happen in the future, and we cannot historically have any credibility in that. The same idea repeated. If it was just teaching people about something that will happen in the future, the disciple would preach that message clearly, and they would clarify it to them. And then, of course, they would not die for something that is theological teaching, not reality. There was no need for an empty tomb narrative. Many times Jesus stressing on his physicality, if it was just an eschatological interpretation. This idea took a lot of people to support and to clarify their opinion, saying, especially Crossan was championing this, that the appearances are fabricated for political interest, leadership, authority, power, and priority. So anyone who Christ appeared to him, quote unquote, means that he is a special guy, he's a special person, and he will need to be the leader of you, because Jesus did not appear to you, so appear to me, so I am the leader because of that. If Peter was interested in authority, Luke would have narrated a special appearance detailed with Jesus talking with him and giving him priority and stuff like that. During his life, I felt strongly that Jesus had an inner circle already, and he had some chosen disciples, and they were treated like leaders already. He took James, John, Peter to the Mount of Transfiguration and at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he commended Peter for his faith, and he called him a rock, and on this rock he will build his church. So they have already leadership places and positions. They didn't need to fabricate the appearances. That's number one. Number two, again, it's a small group of people who are afraid, dispersed, frightened, and who want to take leadership of that group. I mean, who want to take leadership of people who are escaping scrutiny and punishment by the Jewish leader? And what kind of inheritance they will rush that Jesus left behind, that they all fabricate story and will rush to take leadership in it. So it doesn't fit logical criteria. A legend or false testimony, both of them, they are talking about almost the similar stuff, that the disciples were lied about it, either after his death immediately, and they give false testimony that he was resurrected, or later on, years past, there was legend and they adopted that legend about him. We have to assume that all the disciples were dishonest people who lied and invented story without a clear reason, really, and not even one of them corrected the false record, and they all went to their demise willing to die for a lie that they invented. Doesn't fit logic. Here another crafted idea, a neuroanthropological perspective. Neuro, like a neurological vision, anthropology, and cultural. And what he's saying is that any text that we see about these people is a culturally approved visual perception. Their culture is approving that, and it is okay, and they believed it because of their culture approved that. And he went to say that our planet is populated with multiple cultural realities, multiple models, and historians, they have to find a way of writing that history again, taking in consideration the natives' experience and reality. So the cultural reality of Jesus' resurrection, it did not happen in real time and space. They saw it, they approved it because their culture said that. It was real to them, but it is not real to us. So we have to respect them and understand that, and we have to, quote unquote, rewrite or reinterpret or understand what happened really in history, taking in account that their culture is dictating this. In the beginning of his article, he said neuroanthropology is an emergent new research with no proof of its validity. He didn't say it, no proof of validity. He said emergent new research. My interpretation as a physician, we deal with science all the time. If you want to approve a medicine, the FDA will look into research. The research, they have to prove that this medicine is helpful, and they have to prove it with a certain degree of success. 20% success is not acceptable. 50% is not acceptable. Although you may claim it is successful, but that's not acceptable. So we cannot just throw things at the public saying it's a new research, so you don't know about it, so you better listen and believe. And emergent, like, it's not complete yet. He said it's a new emergent and new research and emergent, which means it's not valid. There is no standard to measure if it's accurate or not, and I don't know when to apply it or not to apply it. Can I apply this principle on any historical figure that we heard of? Can we claim that, the people who saw that person, it was just their cultural reality. It was true to them, but not to us. Did Buddha really exist, or his disciples imagine him? Did Muhammad receive a Quran from an angel? Did Moses perform miracles or existed even? So it's really, I wouldn't say dangerous, but it's a nonsense, because it will rock every foundation of looking at history by looking at their culture. That's what they believe, but not us. Plus, it doesn't answer the historical question. What happened to Jesus? Was he really crucified, or it was just a vision of the disciple and they imagined it and became their reality? Plus, really, nothing about Jesus and what happened to him and what they claimed was culturally or religiously approved and accepted. A dead rabbi coming back to life in a bodily form was neither what the disciples expected nor accepted as Jewish believer. The difference in details. There is difference in details among the gospel concerning the place of appearance, and we find the gospel, there are two groups of narration. One is connected with Jerusalem, most appearances there. One is connected with Galilean country. Because there is difference in the appearances, we have to reject all the stories completely. Some of them, they say that. Others, they say the canonical gospel contained propaganda, and they had an agenda to present Jesus in a special way and teaching a message in a special way, and we should not believe in that because it is a propaganda. Others, they claim gospel were not written by eyewitness, and there is an inconsistency between what Paul is saying about flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, and Jesus saying, touch me, a spirit has not flesh and bone as I have. The response. Dr. Licona explains that the different locations of the appearances are to emphasize a theme that was important to the writer. The difference doesn't mean contradictory, it means it adds more to the picture or completing the picture. About the propaganda, many historians, in fact, everyone who writes something has an agenda, has a propaganda to promote. It's not necessarily bad. When Jewish people, historians, they write about the Holocaust, or African Americans, they write about the discrimination of blacks. They want others to know what they endured with the idea or the objective that it doesn't happen again. So propaganda is not bad. It could be good and it could be true. Mark and Luke were not written by eyewitnesses. That is true. But many scholars, they have held that they preserve the eyewitness testimony. When Paul wrote about flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, he is considering the existence in heaven. You want to exist in heaven, flesh and blood will not be able to. Jesus has a different context. He's talking about, I am physically present and I'm not a spirit, come and touch me. The conclusion is that the details present in the sources available to historians, they are adequate to learn what happened to Jesus after his death. Some people said the resurrection was just to fight Docetism, and there is some stress on his physicality. I'm eating, come and touch me, look, put your hand in my side. All of this to fight Docetism, which questioned the reality of Jesus' physical existence in general, but especially his suffering. The response is that if they were responding to Docetism, let it be. It was to correct a wrong understanding, but not to fake up a new idea. Luke and John were, if they were inventing stories to combat Docetism like a spiritual Jesus, why they are mentioning that he appeared and disappeared and materializing through wall at will, that doesn't help their case. Why portray his appearance to Paul as light from heaven? So if they are only fighting Docetism, they should not have these verses and these stories about him. If Jesus did not rise from the dead in bodily form, again, there is no need to die for this. Paul insists that if Jesus is not raised from the dead, and he appeared to many, we are still in our sins. We are the most miserable men, and we are bearing a false testimony. Again, another one of cognitive dissonance. The disciples were suffering from struggle about two difficult ideas, and we don't know which one to accept. So to resolve that, they invented this resurrection, and they wanted to recruit more people to believe in their issue so that it will support their failure. It supports their wrong idea. To have cognitive dissonance, you have to have two contradictory beliefs. And what the Christians at that time saw and experienced, they were not looking for that. So they did not have the idea of two opposing things to struggle. Plus, at the same time, many messianic movements ended with the death of the founder, and we don't find evidence of cognitive dissonance in their history. I know I'm taking too much time. I want to add a story from my practice back home in Egypt. There was a young lady who her father forcing her to marry a man that she does not love. Culturally speaking, she cannot disobey her father. It will be a dishonor to the family and disgrace to her. So she is having that cognitive dissonance, this struggle. I cannot say no to my father. At the same time, I don't want to marry a man that I don't love. How can I resolve these two struggle, which the disciples didn't have two opposing struggle, because Jesus died and they didn't expect him to rise again. So this young lady, when we saw her in the class, she resolved her struggle by waking up one morning having paralysis from the waist down. Mr. Perfect, when he saw that, he didn't want to move on with the wedding, so he turned his back and left. No marriage is happening, and father is not upset with daughter disrespecting him. So she resolved the two struggle, but with a huge price. Her nervous system is normal, but psychologically she solved the problem by that, sadly enough. What is this? This is just a collection of stories that I collected from people who are saying things related to the resurrection. One is that we don't need the appearances to prove the resurrection. We can believe in the resurrection without the appearances. The women went to the wrong tomb, and Jesus' body was not buried, but a cross, and said he was left in a ditch, for the dogs and vultures to finish him off. Some people said a female lament tradition present in human culture everywhere. It just started this way, and then male exegetical tradition about the resurrection came to the story. They say that women who are mourning the dead person, they'll say, oh, he was a great guy, we're gonna miss him, oh, he was good. And then they start inventing stories like, oh, he said this one time, and he said, and they are not true. And then some of them adopted what the disciples teaching, that he will come again. They said, oh, he come again, he will come again. And then all of a sudden it became a resurrection story. So that's a lament tradition. Jesus' burial and the empty tomb legend were late element. They believe that Mark invented this story, and he invented also the story of Joseph of Arimathea, and or because the disciples lived in a world where resurrection is always expected, they used that language about Jesus. Response on each one. If we don't need the appearances to believe in the resurrection, then what is the proof that he was resurrected? I mean, if he was resurrected but we don't have any appearances, how do you prove that? So that takes this away. The women went to the wrong tomb. That's misunderstanding of culture. The women went and saw the place. They rested for the Sabbath. They wanted to buy spices to go, so they know the place. Then also, if he was eaten by dogs and he did not have a tomb, why have many portions of the scriptures detailing, all of that, and stealing his body and going to the Roman and asking to them to seal the tomb? We don't need that if he was, historically speaking, he was not put in a tomb, but he was thrown in the ditch. A female lament tradition, as I mentioned, there is no proof of that. Mark invented the tomb, and he invented Joseph of Arimathea. Again, that's not story enough to prove that all of a sudden the disciples went to preach his resurrection and dying for it. Also, at the tomb there was Nicodemus. Was Nicodemus also an invention? And they said that it was the language of the time. That's why they used it about Jesus. Well, in fact, it's the opposite. Jewish people believed at that time resurrection is not for one person, and it doesn't happen like this at all. So it was not really the language of the culture. Again, if this is the bodily appearance is the most likely hypothesis, then it should be taken as the most logical one. I collected all these pictures, hoping to give you a break from one section to another, but now I'm wrapping up things together. I'm bringing all the pictures together to the last one, which is the supernatural objective theory. This theory, it takes the biblical text as credible testimony, and the scripture is at face value, accurate representation of what the disciple experienced at that time. Someone said that to prove the resurrection, we're not going to prove it in the scientific way that we expect today, but in the historical sense, it will be enough evidence and adequate to build a respectable hypothesis. Another thing I'm going to touch base on, what do you have instead that will be challenging? And as we have seen, all of the other theories are not really meeting that challenge. Touch and go really, the tomb. The fact that the grave cloth were left behind showed that the body was not carried off by thieves or others, so no one stole the body. Their position suggests that they were not unwrapped, but the body passed through them like going through locked doors. So he went through the cloth as he went through locked door. I read an article, I'm just mentioning Shroud of Turin. It says that Jesus passed on a subatomic level, and they had two physicists who are supporting this by theories. It's worth mentioning, it's worth looking into it as a scientific part of the resurrection. The physicality of Jesus' body. The stone of the tomb needed to be removed to let the resurrected body come out. Jesus ate, broke bread with the disciples, was touchable, and his body had the physicality or physical marks of the crucifixion. Someone said that they did not recognize him because he was not the same person, but actually Christ had to go through suffering to reach his glorious body, the glorious body. Plus, they were not really expecting him to come back. The followers of Jesus suddenly believed in him as Lord. That's a very good article I read. They did not believe him as a rabbi who came from the dead, which should be. I mean, hey, our master was dead, now he's alive, our master is alive. Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus came. Lazarus is still Lazarus. So they should have believed in Jesus as their rabbi. But no, that's not the case. They suddenly believed in him as Lord and God. They understood that his resurrection was an approval from the Father, that Jesus is the Son of God and he is his glory. That kind of faith does not come before, but comes after the appearances. And as a proof, Thomas and Paul are examples. Someone said that he went to heaven, Jesus went to heaven like Elijah, but Elijah did not die, so I cannot give this same example. More evidence first. All of a sudden the Christians started to regard the first day of the week as their special day. There must be a reason for that. There is no evidence that anyone ever venerated Jesus' tomb. Like the ladies, the women rested on the Sabbath and they were going to the tomb to just anoint his body and honor him. There was no secondary burial performed for Jesus. That's an interesting point. They said that Jesus was buried as a part of two-stage burial. The first stage is what you did. You happen to bury the person in a tomb. The second stage will come after 6 to 8 months later on, when the person will decompose and become a bunch of bones. Then they will take that, they will go to the second stage to honor that person, remove the body, put them in a special place, different, and then make the tomb ready for the next person who would be using it. Now I remembered why they said that Jesus was put in a brand new tomb that no one was put in it before. Because that's the custom that, you can put someone there after 9 months or so, you remove the bones and, you put the new dead person, you can use it for the family for generations. That was not done to Jesus, which means that he didn't need it because he was not in the tomb. Jesus also predicted his death many, many times, and this has to be taken for something here. Lastly, I want to talk about necessary and sufficient. Two things were really historical, that the tomb was empty and that Jesus appeared to the disciples. The tomb by itself could not have generated the belief. The empty tomb could be empty because grave robbery was very common and not resurrection. And we saw this happen when when Mary Magdalene or Peter and John went to the tomb. When it was empty, they did not say he was resurrected. They thought someone took him or something we cannot explain. Seeing the post-resurrection appearances by themselves could be hallucination if we have the body in the tomb. But the two of them together, they are offering a strong, sufficient condition. The empty tomb and the appearances brought together form in combination a sufficient condition for the rise of the early Christian belief. All right, is it necessary? Are the empty tomb and the appearances also necessary? Well, if you can bring another theory that will explain what happened better than this one, then the appearances and the empty tomb are not necessary. They are not. But as we have seen, a careful examination of all the possibilities presented show that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation. The combination of the tomb and the appearances is the only possible explanation for the early Christian faith. The combination forms a set of circumstances which are both necessary and sufficient for the rise of the Christian belief. In conclusion, the fact that dead people do not ordinarily rise to life is not an objection. It's what we believe. The only difference is that dead people do not return to life naturally. We believe that Jesus did not return to life naturally, but in a supernatural way. None of the competing theory offers a logical and acceptable explanation of the post-resurrection appearances. Every argument of them, as I mentioned, falls apart when under careful scrutiny. Christianity has spread because the disciples believed the fact that they have encountered the risen Christ in a physical form, and their charisma proved that. And again, if the bodily appearances hypothesis turns to be the most logical, best explanation of what happened, it should be taken as the most logical and reasonable cause of the faith and the charisma of the disciples. I want to apologize for the length of the video one more time, and I want to thank you for listening, and I'll be available, I guess, in a class for questions. Thank you.